Welcome to another episode of the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. In this episode, I will be exploring one of the most important and timely questions facing our country today. What would it look like if Americans were to rethink their Constitution? For a long time, the thought of holding a constitutional convention has been dismissed by most Americans. Something debated by historians and legal scholars, perhaps, but rarely engaged in by ordinary citizens. Yet, recently, that conversation has begun to emerge. Across the country, citizens are asking deeper questions about whether the political system we inherited is capable of meeting the challenges of the 21st century. Organizations like Unify USA, Braver Angels, Better Together America, CELDEF, Alliance for Democracy, Citizens Take Action, and many more are drafting their own amendments, forming their own citizen assemblies. Dr. Vergara, welcome to the Peaceful Political Revolution in America podcast. It's a great honor to have you on the show today. So welcome, and let's dive right into it. System corruption, constitutional ideas for an anti-oligarchical republic. This is such a germane subject these days. So I wanted to first kind of get a brief sense of what the book was about for you and how you approached the topic of corruption in democracies.
Well, thank you for having me first in this timely podcast that basically is what we need to be listening to in this time of crisis. So thank you for that. So the book is actually my PhD dissertation, but this was not like an intellectual endeavor only. It was born from the kind of deep understanding that all of the constitutional democracies around the world are faulty. They all look the same despite the variations. There are, national variations. And this started from the kind of the knowing that in my own country, I am from Chile, where, as you may know, there was a dictatorship led by Pinochet, who was funded by the CIA in order to topple the previous government that was a government that was socialist in nature. And Chile, from kind of a socialist project, became a neoliberal model for the world. And in my country, we have the constitution that the dictator himself drafted and is still enforced today. So part of my kind of study of the law and the constitution is based on this idea that a constitution can look very liberal in a way and have the typical features of a liberal constitution, but on the ground it is enforced and it actually is a model for domination and for exploitation that has been legalized. So this understanding of my own country allowed for me to be critical with the rest of the kind of constitutional world and understand that all constitutions are in a way faulty and they need repair, immediate, urgent repair, but not to make it better, but actually to change the system itself into a more democratic one, because it is not really democratic from its origins. As in Chile was a dictatorship, in the US was a counter-revolution, what created the Constitution. And in many places around the world are really the elites who write the Constitution and impose those laws on the people.
We don't get that in the United States. You said our Constitution was a counter-revolution. Thomas Paine left the United States when the convention convened. He was kind of fed up with it. He just didn't think it was, he liked the way it was made. He thought the convention model was kind of the way to approach this, but the result was highly undemocratic to him. So he was pretty disappointed with what we created in 1787. But, the country was falling apart. And I think these guys really felt a need to get hold of power so that they could keep the country from collapsing. I'm not saying that I give them a pass for what they did, because we could have had a much more democratic political system in 1787 had the Anti-Federalists won. It would have been far more democratic than it is today. But on some level, I have to give them a little credit for trying to save something that was in its infancy and obviously failing on many, many fronts. So how do you prevent corruption from developing in these kinds of systems when I think in particular ours was kind of started with this idea that the people could govern themselves somehow and manage their affairs, but in 1787 that wasn't working out very well for the country. So there was a real, there's a bit of a conflict there.
Yes, of course. As in the book, as I show in the book, I try to look at the intellectual history of how the principles that were used during the convention and to create the rule of law had very long legs in history. And these legs were not really democratic, they were aristocratic in nature. So what I come to kind of trace in the book and try to do with all the kind of analysis of law. I do law from a material critical perspective. So from where the law emerges and how it is applied, the effects that it has in society, and not just the word of the law that could, look very, very nice and all about liberty and democracy. But at the end is how do you operationalize that law and how do you impose it and how it is suffered by the people, if you will, what counts for me. And that kind of relation with society and with the kind of socioeconomic reality is not detached from the way that the Constitution came about. So the Constitution came about as a response to the Shays Rebellion and other rebellions of veterans, basically, who, after the War of Independence, and who were farmers, yeoman farmers, owners of their own land. They were also soldiers. They went back to their lands, and their lands were spoiled. They didn't have, many resources to invest in their own fields. To basically reconstruct, their businesses, and they had to get in debt with the commercial elite, and then a couple of years of bad weather or drought and problems. They were in debt with the elites. They would lose their farms, and not only that, they will go into prison, because at that point, if you owned money, you would go and get in prison for a few years. So we had the veterans who had liberated basically the country from the British actually being put in prison and being deprived of active citizenship because they were losing their land. And at that point, land and active citizenship were together. So you immediately were disenfranchised just for basically fighting the war for your country. So these veterans got together, and after petitioning and doing all the things that citizens do to basically seek redress, they didn't find any. They couldn't. They were asking for a abolition of debt, for having more years to pay, for having some wiggle room, basically to get on their feet. And they get no response. So what they did, they took over the courthouses, burned all the records of the debt, and basically rebelled. And the convention was a response to this very alarming process in which the people themselves were asking for redress regarding property and wealth. And this was a direct attack to the elites of planters and moneylenders and lawyers who basically had, and commercial elite in general, who had done very well in these moments of crisis, investing and getting returns at the detriment, basically, of the agricultural sectors of the country. So basically, the Constitution, and we see from the people that were present in that conversation and were arguing about the principles that should undergird the state. The idea was that the constitution or the state had as principal objective to protect private property, not to give liberty or prosperity to the people, but actually to protect property from this group of people that were trying to basically undermine the natural right to property. And of course, the framers were having all this discussion based on the English intellectuals like John Locke in the 17th century, who were part of the imperial business in a way. And for them, the right to property was natural, and therefore we needed to think about the democracy as a democracy of property owners. And whoever didn't own property was not really part of that democratic project. So in a way, there was a consensus, I would say, of the elites at that time in the US that it was crucial to defend private property from democratic demands. And the Constitution was created, its archetype, its model was based on this consensus of protecting private property. And today we know that after all these years, this actually has been the case. And today we have a level of inequality, of wealth inequality, that is even beyond the level of inequality that we had during the French Revolution.
Yeah, if you look at historical trends, inequality was fairly restrained prior to 1787, although there was that aristocratic class in the United States. After the Constitution was ratified, inequality began to skyrocket, and
Yes.
even after the Civil War, which is remarkable to me, that you could have the beginnings of a Gilded Age just 10 years after the Civil War was ended. It's remarkable that the system continued to protect this idea that property was supreme.
Yes, and this is not only in the United States. We're talking about the United States here in this podcast, but basically this is the base of all constitutions around the world. The majority of them are really neoliberal. Chile's constitution is the most neoliberal today on the books, but all of the constitutions that are based on this liberal principle and that have the right to property as a human right, even connected to the right to life. This is something that basically creates a structure of law that allows for the accumulation of property, because the more property you have, the easiest it is to get more of that. And because there's so much to go around, that property basically trickles up. This wealth trickles up. It is the dispossession of the masses that allow for the accumulation of wealth at the top. And the rule of law allows for this accumulation to be almost risk-free, because contracts need to be protected. And then the courts are there to enable that protection and secure that protection of the laws that are in the books, which are there to protect private property.
It's almost as if it's a marriage between criminal enterprise and, instituted governmental institutions. It's woven together. They're almost how you say, wedded together. There's like a criminal enterprise taking place within the government, and its corruption is ubiquitous. I'm not sure that it all stems from the Constitution itself, because, for example, Denmark, I believe, is one of the least corrupt countries in the world, but there's nothing in their constitution that specifically prevents corruption from happening, as I understand it. Is that your understanding as well? It has more to do with the norms and the values in the country to a degree, although they do have certainly some anti-bribery laws and things like that, but there's a lot of transparency and accountability in their constitution. Maybe that's the solution for Denmark, as well as their kind of civic values and their own culture and that sort of thing.
Well, I think the elite capture of government, which was what you have been saying about this kind of criminal enterprise, is what I call oligarchic democracies. So a democracy that functions, there is free and fair elections so far as we can have them, right? We have all kinds of issues with freedom of speech, but generally, free and fair. We have separation of powers. We have a working judiciary. All these things basically are there and have not been undermined. However, corruption is rampant in a way. And one of the things that the book explores and basically makes clear is that corruption is already a loaded word that we have basically transformed and reduced to only individual corruption. So in the book, I highlight three types of corruption. First, the individual corruption, which is basically the quid pro quo, the official that gets money on the side, or, from procurements, the classical, or nepotism, right? Fraud, all these classical criminal activities, which basically will end up with someone in prison. At least that's what we want, right? The bad apple will be imprisoned, and then the rest of the system will go, clean. Okay. Then there's the second type of corruption, which is institutional corruption, which is basically when systems within the larger, social systems or industries or institutions really work for a different objective than the one that they should. For example, the healthcare industry in the United States, the system as it has been created and reformed, is not really a system to allow for people to be more healthy, right? Or to basically socialize the risks of being unhealthy, but actually is about enriching the insurance business and basically making money for pharmaceuticals, for the insurance companies, for hospitals, but not really centered on the health of the population. So it is really for making money for a few instead of creating welfare and health for everyone. So therefore you can say that that system of healthcare is systemically corrupt or institutional corrupt. And then we have the structural corruption, the systemic one, which is basically the Constitution itself. The way that we thought our systems were drawn, for example, in terms of democracy, that they were democracies, but they actually work not for the benefit of the majority, for the demos, for the people, but actually work for enriching the few that are already rich and powerful in a way. So the rules that are created through our representative institutions by those representatives that are supposedly going to legislate in our favor, they legislate to protect the interest of the powerful few instead of serving the many. So we think that basically this kind of a constitution, this constitutional democracy, is really an oligarchy. The rule by the few for the benefit of the few, but just with authorization from below, us just voting for them. And this is something that is replicated everywhere, as I said, and Denmark is not an exception. However, when a constitution comes into place, when it's basically the norms are written down, they are superimposed into a context that has history, that has values, that has already a distribution of property. So when you have a more egalitarian culture and a distribution of wealth that is not so unequal, then even if you have a liberal constitution that does not have any safeguards for inequality not to grow, which has been growing ever since in a way. Denmark is one of the least unequal countries in the world, but the inequality is growing. Okay, so that allows for that kind of context to delay the corruption. If you have a scenario in which you have total freedom of enterprise, which is not really a good thing, that you really make lots of money and charge immense amounts of money to almost ripping people off in a way to make your fortune in a way. If you have those kind of laissez-faire rules, then you allow for rapid accumulation of wealth. You can change your wealth in one generation. If that happens, you have a system that creates and enables inequality and therefore oppression and precarity. Not only wealth at the top, but actually domination and exploitation at the bottom.
We have some interesting values in the United States. The American exceptionalism is one huge, I guess you could call it a value. rugged individualism, the frontiersmen, and pulling up your bootstraps, and all this self-reliance kind of stuff, and the primacy of individuality. The individual is somehow more important than the collective whole in the United States. It's how I see it. I don't know if you agree with that, but that's my impression from living here in this country. It's all about the the me kind of society, not the we society. It's much
Yeah,
more.
it is correct, and it's correct historically, and in terms of the foundations of the thinkers that were the inspiration for the framers in the United States. So that kind of individualism that you're talking about is born in the United Kingdom, basically, with John Locke and others, who are the fathers of liberalism, of the idea that the individual is the basic unity of society, while you cannot really be a individual and flourish as an individual if you're by yourself. You can only be an individual in society. So the Aristotelian, wisdom that you can only be a human if you are in society, that only beasts and gods live outside of society. So therefore, the society is prior to the individual, right? There's no individuality without society. That, and of course, the idea of the common good, the idea that economics or making money out of just money lending was just terrible, was something that it shouldn't be pursued, was, anathema for the Greeks, at least for the Greeks that were more sophisticated, right? That kind of thinking that also was present during the Middle Ages is completely, undermined during the modernity period, and the individual comes in as the kind of bearer of all rights, and this idea of almost the superhuman, that you can really conquer everything, and your relationship with nature changes in a way from living in an ecosystem that you are in touch with whatever is around you, and you need to keep the balance, to a very extractive, rentierist, the end justify the means kind of mentality that it basically allows for the destruction of ecosystems and for the dispossession of the majority of people that lived off the land towards, accumulation of wealth by wealthy barons, and for these same people to become, wage laborers and part of the Industrial Revolution. And then we know what all this kind of evolution has brought us, this progress has brought us to the brink of ecocide in a way, and destruction. So I think there is really connected to this kind of long history of kind of British identity also as the individual, as the center, that then passes to the United States through this very knowledgeable framers, and that is reproduced, codified in law, reproduced, and the whole culture is basically developed around that individualism that does not allow for any limits to the accumulation of property. If you think about it, the only thing that does not have limits in the United States is the accumulation of property. You can accumulate and accumulate ad infinitum without any limit to it. Everything else has a limit, but the accumulation of wealth. So therefore, it is a system that is an oligarchy in a way. It is the one, a society that is moved by the desire to possess and oppress.
We came to North America looking for religious freedom, right? And then we immediately began a genocide and exterminated tens of millions of indigenous people, imported hundreds of thousands of slaves into the country who had no rights whatsoever. And yet we pride ourselves somehow on being a country based on freedom. But our origins are rather different than that. We really, I guess you could say, we got off on the wrong foot.
Well, it is not, this is a very, interesting question and comment, in the sense that, I don't think the US got off the wrong foot. It's just, the freedom that was created or carved out for, the white entrepreneur, immigrant who came to this country, was based upon the usurpation of land, the enclosure of the commons, the same as it happened in England, in which the wealthy feudal lords were enclosing common forests and putting just fences around it and claiming them as theirs, depriving the people from the rights to actually access those spaces in which they can, get their animals to eat grass and get timber. All these things are essential for life at that time. In the US, it was the same thing. The enclosure of the lands of indigenous peoples for the benefit of the, entrepreneur. This is connected, right? It's not that you can have freedom for all. It's never like a win-win situation when you have like this windfalls, right? And if it's not, you're not taking from the indigenous peoples, you're taking from the earth. That happens with, gold or oil. It is kind of this extractive mentality of making, wealth out of almost nothing very easily and fast. This is on the one hand, but I think would be wrong to think about the United States as only, a place in which this relation took place, in the sense that it's always about, the freedom of some against the domination of many, in a way. But actually, there is a creativity and a freedom to explore in very different ways that you don't have in other countries. There is a mentality of creativity and a kind of embrace of creativity that you don't see in other places, which are more conservative or more traditionally bound. So in a way, there's two sides of the same coin. In a way, you can have freedom for some, and that freedom will allow for exponential freedom to explore and to create, and on the other, for the domination of many. And that could never be separated, in a way. And the challenge is, how can we really separate it and really decouple freedom from domination, in a way?
Americans are known for their ingenuity, as you suggest, but we're not very inventive. We're not very creative when it comes to our political system. We've let it kind of fossilize, if that's the right word, over the last couple hundred years. We haven't done much to change our Constitution or to address the deficiencies, the democratic deficiencies in the Constitution. So for some reason, we have this blind, sort of almost religious belief in our political system. It's hard to explain to people how that actually happened. What's your take on why Americans are not very creative when it comes to their political system?
So I would say that the first thing is a general approach to higher law. In every country in the world, the idea of the basic law or the constitution is something that is really over the head of everyone. First of all, it's almost like sacred text. And then you have these jurists who are trained for many years to decode the text and to interpret the text. So it's almost like a religious, elite that is able to control the meaning of the text and to say what is correct and what is incorrect and what can and cannot be done. So this is, in general, we have kind of a reverence for law, and especially the common people who are not trained in legal language, and legal language is actively trying to be convoluted in a way, not to be really transparent to people, the same as sacred texts were before in Latin, in order not to allow for the people to read for themselves and not have this approach to religion that is closer and you could interpret your own text. It's the same thing. In the US, in addition, we have an active sacralization of the text in a way that the Constitution, and specifically the Bill of Rights, an addendum to the Constitution, which was not part of it, as we know, right? It was added after, and James Madison was against actually having a Bill of Rights because he thought that they would be unenforceable. Doesn't matter. It's not, you can have the right to many things, but then the state is not really going to provide it, and you will not have enough, manpower to actually police that. And the courts are not going to be able to save you. So why have a Bill of Rights that will not be enforceable? However, then, because the Constitution was not going to be approved without a Bill of Rights, then it was added. But then the Bill of Rights became basically like the Ten Commandments. And anybody from any walk of life, they understand what is the First Amendment and the Second Amendment, and maybe not all the amendments, but basically there is a knowledge of the Constitution that is more profound and more emotional than any other people in the world that I have been in touch, in a way. Like, the people understand that constitutional law is something that they don't understand and it should be respected, but they don't have that emotional attachment with the text. I think that marks, your identity, and doesn't allow you to be critical to a text that you admire so much because it's sacred. You're not going to start editing the Bible, right? You're not going to start editing your text. And also the sacralization of the founders, the idea that these were exceptional humans that were really selfless and perfect almost. But part of what we should do is actually contextualize them. And if the majority of the founders were money lenders or speculators or planters, then you need to understand that that is their position in society. Today, it would be equivalent to having Wall Street people writing the Constitution for us, in a way. And this is, or the Elon Musks of the world, right? So that would not be legitimate. However, due to all these years, hundreds of years, 200 years and some, of a narrative from the state to sacralize that Constitution and the narrative that comes along, it does not allow for the regular people to actually contest it. In addition, the third issue with this is that the rules for changing the Constitution, for calling a Constituent Assembly, for calling the people to interact and make decisions on what they want the rules in common to be, it's almost impossible to achieve. Because you have to have a great majority of the states in favor. You need to have in both houses of Congress. So all of the institutions that are representative, that is, that they have been elected through electoral means, based on lobbyism and campaign finance and all this, corruption that we already know politicians are, the majority of them are tainted somehow. Then you know that those institutions are really putting the brakes on change. They are blocking any kind of change that can come from below. Because if we get the people together to actually decide on the rules of the game, I can assure you that a wealth tax or a wealth cap or something like that will immediately become a law, and that a care for environment and, for the basically ripping off of the people by corporations will also be part of it. People are suffering, and in a way, the experience from that kind of suffering should be transformed into law, and that is what the elites want to prevent. So makes it very difficult for people to actually do it through the rules, and extraordinarily difficult to do it against the rules or outside of the rules due to the massive structure of the United States, which is based on federalism, which, according to James Madison, was the first kind of valve, blocking basically the mass action by the popular classes to contest the power of elites.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
Yes.
Can you explain a little bit about that for the listeners here? I'd like to know more about that.
Yeah, so basically when James Madison was thinking about how are the mechanisms through which you would allow the people to vote and to be participating in a way, there was a real a threat, or was perceived threat, that the majority of the people at some point will become dispossessed. You said that before the convention there was lots of equality around, between 70 and 75% of the population were yeoman farmers. So there was a lot of equality, way more than in Europe. But already, with what I have already related about the Shays Rebellion, there was a lot of dispossession going on in real time at that time. So basically, they were very afraid of this. So one of the tasks was, how do we protect basically what the property that the elites have against the claims of the that is possessed is if we have universal suffrage. Because if we have universal suffrage and the majority of people will be dispossessed, then the probability that those people will come together into one single party and basically take over is very high. So the best way of, not preventing this to happen is to break it apart, not allowing for the lower classes to band together and contest for power. And the first structural way to do this was to breaking apart the different states with different legislations and jurisdictions, making it very difficult for the working class of California to get together with the working class of New York in order to contest power.
Right, we can't overlook the malapportionment of the Senate. Every state has 2 senators, which is a highly undemocratic feature of the United States Constitution. So this is kind of what you're pointing to, is the structural deficits in the Constitution. You said there's a couple of different types of corruption, and you're focused on system corruption.
Yes, systemic corruption. Systemic corruption basically is based on this ancient idea, that is so previous to the 18th century, where corruption became only individual. So before that, the ancients was always musing about, how everything that we create, either there is alive or non-alive, corrupts. So there's nothing, that Plato would say famously, nothing that would withstand the time passing in a way. There's things corrupt. So for the Greeks, the physical world and the artificial world that we create are not really very different. We create, they mimic each other. We create artificial things that also decay. And for them, for all the Greeks and the Romans, the systems that we create of law and political institutions are systems that we create, and therefore they tend to corrupt. So the more freedom that you have inside a constitution to basically push around the rules, the faster the kind of straitjacket that is limiting, individual ambition and greed basically will, become undone in a way. And that kind of corruption is not because of one person. It's not because of one party. It's because the people inside that are more powerful, relatively speaking, will be more ingenuous in a way to bypass the rules of the game and be kind of free of the straitjacket and make all the kind of limitations more to erode and be more porous in a way, until that structure will be so different from the original structure that it will mutate into another one. And for the Greeks, you had monarchy as the kind of good one-person leadership. So a monarch governs or rules for the common good, for the good of the people. A monarch can become a tyrant, so a corrupt monarchy becomes a tyranny, that basically it is one person ruled, but basically for his own sake and his friends, not the common good. Then there's always an upheaval by the aristocracy, and aristocratic government means just the government of the best. And you can think about the best minds or the best leaders in society taking over and writing all the rules for us. And that could work for a while until, the second or third generation of these leaders that are not, really virtuous coming to being, and they just want to, have benefit for themselves. So you have an oligarchy, not the rule of the best, but the rule of the few, for the benefit of the few, who are always the rich. And of course, that it degenerates so much until you have another upheaval that basically brings democracy back in a way, or at the end of the cycle, or back in, if you think that, of the origins of all time, there was always democracy, the government of the many, or the community self-government, right? And this community, in a way, according to different authors, was not a good thing. So for Plato, who was an aristocrat, democracy was inherently a corrupt form of government, because people believed that they were equal. So they were not taking care of the rules. So they were writing laws. I mean, the examples are a little bit ridiculous, but they would say, well, and the women were all outside and talking and making their opinions heard, and the animals were not obeying the rules, and everything is a jungle, basically. This is like the idea of the anti-democrat about democracy, right? And for Aristotle, a little bit different. Basically, democracy comes about when this equality is realized and everybody is taking part in government. And this also kind of, it is for him very dangerous because you don't have hierarchy, and people that are used to hierarchy and used to having an elite run things really are scared of, you know, the people governing themselves. And this is something that was a very crucial for the ancients. So for them was obvious that all of the regimes that you could put in place, they will never last. They will always corrupt. So you need updates, you need renewal. So through, for example, Niccolo Machiavelli in the 16th century in Florence, he would say, well, we need constant renewal because there's no rules that will be so perfect that will be keeping contained basically the elite. So you need to, every once in a while, you know, press the restart button basically and look at what laws are you missing, what people need to go to prison or be judged, right? And what kind of updates you need to do to the constitution as a kind of a technology of containing oligarchic power in a way. This was one of the visions of the democratic republic. And these ideas were lost during modernity. There was only one model, which was the liberal constitutionalism, was a neutral technology, if you will, that were going to preserve liberty for all, and all these things that were sold basically in that time of the 18th century based on the idea of progress and benefits coming with it, and basically no critical thinking about what are the conditions actually of the common people under those technologies of law.
There's a real tension between the elites and the, let's say, common people around the world. And I think part of that is because the people haven't really understood how to organize themselves peacefully and thoughtfully to deliberate over constitutional matters. Chile did this recently, and I want to get your thoughts on their effort to reform the Constitution before we go. But it also occurs to me that there's been an apparent rise in the level of corruption in the United States over the last, let's say, decade, going back, we could say back to Ronald Reagan or before. I don't want to be partisan here about this. But what are your thoughts about the state of corruption in the United States these days, and what can we do about it?
Well, if you see corruption and the indexes of corruption, not only in the United States, but around the world, there is an overlap between the amount of corruption that is perceived and the amount of inequality that exists in the country. So to more inequality, there's more basically money to be bribing and to be, you know, taking advantage of. So the individual corruption increases when you have structural corruption, in a way, in the sense that you have laws and tax legislations and regulations of all type that allow for the accumulation of wealth at levels that are exponential in a way. When you have those kinds of rules, those rules are not neutral. They are created and drafted through lobbyism from big corporations. So they basically are instruments of the oligarchy. So in a way, they're not neutral as we understand the rule of law we need to preserve. We don't, as moderns, we don't have not even a conception of a corrupt law. For us, law is not corrupt. It's almost like the opposite. But we need to understand that corruption is beyond the law in a way. Actually, law can be corrupt if the law was basically created through, in a way, undue influence and is applied for the benefit of a few. In a way, we have, Citizens United and the campaign finance laws, and Clinton, who actually legalized, lobbyism, right? So instead of getting rid of the lobbyists, who are the middle people between, interest groups and legislators, and they basically are paid for access, which is of course corrupt if you think about it, or to give money to candidates. This was of course corrupt, and were illegal at the beginning of the 20th century. So they were illegal before. we couldn't deal with it, so we legalized them, and now they're part of, the structure. So therefore, that allows for individual corruption to be rampant in a way, to start very in the 70s, mid 70s, after Reagan, as you well said, because Reagan basically is the corollary of Pinochet at the time. Thatcher and Reagan and Pinochet were in ruling Chile, the United States, and Britain at that time, and all shared information about how to apply neoliberal policies in order to allow for accumulation of wealth and this windfall of profits for the upper classes. This was part of the strategy of neoliberalism. So you have that kind of connection between individual corruption and systemic corruption, the corruption of the system as a whole, as democracy working for a few, not for the many, as it should, right? And that, of course, is paired with the lack of organization that you were saying before. There is, especially in the United States, in the non-indigenous communities, there is little tradition outside of the real activists in terms of how to make decisions collectively. We incorporate voting in every assembly. There's kind of individualism and leadership that stays in the way. There's a little solidarity or not a lot of history of solidarity outside of the more activist campaigns. The activists in the US are amazing. I have been in many of the kind of protests, and there's always lots of people putting their bodies on the line. So I really take my hat off for, the activists in the US. I was recently watching a documentary on Standing Rock, and that is you see it almost only in the United States, in a way, people putting their bodily integrity for a cause that it doesn't even impact them directly, in a way. So this is remarkable. However, there is little of the history of organization. So going back to the Chilean experiment on constitution making, there was Chile, again, also very neoliberal. All the kind of assembly-based structures were obliterated during the dictatorship. So people were even afraid to go vote, in a way. They don't want to be political. They don't want to even be involved, in a way. However, the situation was so bad with the neoliberal model that people went out to protest after, there was an increase in the metro fare, a little increase in the public transportation, and people just went out. And the media, as we know, is all also controlled by a big business. The media was not showing this, was showing only about some kind of conflict and violence on the side, but not really about the massive demonstrations. And social media played a big role in being the kind of counter-hegemonic form of media at that time. So the people started getting together for the first time with their neighbors. People that didn't even know their names, never had gone to an assembly, never had gone, no union, nothing whatsoever. They didn't even vote. But after the crisis, they said, well, now is the time. And they just spontaneously said, okay, we're doing it. And people started gathering in their neighborhoods and started, talking about what is to be a neoliberal subject in this world, in a way, that you think that everything is your fault, that you were, lay off from your work because you're not good enough, or because you were consuming too much and you were in debt. People have all kinds of stories, medical debt, all kinds of crises in their lives. But when they start talking, they understand that cannot be an individual failure, because everybody has his stories. It is a structural failure. So in that moment, the people say, well, we need to change the system. And if the system is the constitution, well, let's rewrite it. And there were more than, there were at least 3,000 different assemblies, territorial, throughout Chile. We are 4,000 kilometers long. And people just started gathering from all walks of life, and they started drafting their own articles. And there was a whole pedagogy about how to do it, because if you go and read the Bill of Rights, or you go and read about the right to water or the right to housing in other constitutions in the world, you see that the phrasing of those rights is very simple. You don't need much. You don't need a kind of, not even a high school education to actually draft some basic principles that then can be fleshed out by legislators in a way. So people were empowered by, lawyers and activists that were teaching. Myself, I had a weekly YouTube constituent power and constituent process school, and basically just bringing down basically the high law into everyday life and teaching basically how to draft a constitution, do it yourself in a way. And people started doing it, and the government decided they were so threatened by this process that was happening, on the outside, extra legally, that they didn't allow for these assemblies to actually participate formally in the process. They only allowed for individual petitions. So you had to basically have an idea or draft a mini article and then get, 20,000 signatures in order for you to pitch your article to the representative, the convention in a way. So, and people, and this is during COVID, people couldn't do it. They had to do it in person. It was all very difficult for the people not to do it. However, they did it anyway. Thousands of people, just started drafting things and getting together in the weekends to do it. And many of those articles actually made it almost wholesale into the draft. So this was really a victory from below. And then the draft was defeated because basically of the rules of the game. The government didn't educate anyone about the Constitution. The far right took over the narrative, saying that the Constitution was even worse than the one that we had before. Forced around 40% of the people that didn't vote in the first round to go vote with high penalties if they didn't. So people that were not in the process, that were very conservative, and they didn't know, they didn't read the Constitution, they didn't do anything about it. They were basically the victims of advertisement and fake news. And the project was defeated, but not because it was a bad project, because basically it was a structural push to undermine what would have been the most progressive constitution in the world.
Yeah. Who called for the Constitution? How was the convention actually formed?
It was very interesting. So basically, the government decided to increase the metro fare, which was a cents on the dollar, very small, but it added up, right? And the president at that time was a billionaire, the richest, almost the richest person in Chile, and the guy who brought the credit card business to Chile. So this guy, who also has accused of corruption, had like around 15% approval rating at the time. Okay, so almost in the like margin of error. Yeah. Okay, so this thing happened, and one of his ministers went out to defend the measure of increasing, the ticket by saying, well, if you want to go on the off-peak moment, you just need to wake up an hour earlier. So basically, a guy who, born in a golden, cradle, was saying to the working classes, well, if you want to pay less, just wake up at 4 a.m. and go to work at that time. So basically, it was very indignified. People were, very struck by it. And the students, so it was very a sign of solidarity from the very beginning. The students, high school students, to whom this increase in the tariff didn't apply because they have a special card, they decided to protest for their families. So they created this slogan, evade the fare as another way to fight. So they would get to, plan in social media and storm some of the biggest subway stations, and they would just evade the fare and invite everyone to do it. And they would do it in alternate days, so the government didn't know what to do. Then they started beating them up, and it was worse because they had like all kinds of videos of like cops pulling girls' hairs, and trying to take them out of the subway, which is a hybrid private-public industry, right? It is not really strictly private, so it is like the state is in between, right? And then after 2 to 3 weeks, this just was a snowballing effect. It escalated. So in order for the students to not storm the subway stations, the government had the brilliant idea of closing them down. So in a Friday afternoon, after a whole week of working, they decided that the most important hubs of the subway stations, they would be closed in order to avoid the evasion of the fare. So basically, working classes came back, going back to their houses, and they had to march back to their houses. So the students were marching, and they just like a natural, march from everywhere, from the center to the periphery, started, and people were on their feet on the ground, and it was really like a crazy, not violent, but really kind of a lot of people outside. And the government saw this; it was so bad that I think they panicked. And one of the things that happened that never was resolved is that immediately there were some sabotage going on in the subway stations. But it was a coordinated sabotage that has never been investigated. So more than 27 stations of the subway were set ablaze at the same time. And you understand that it's all full of metal. So it's not that you can just like put some wood and, burn it down. You need to have access to a special place where all the electricity is and some special acid to break it down. So the rumors are that it was police that did it because they wanted to stop it and call a state of emergency. So this president, who was very unpopular, called a kind of a national, gathering, and he says immediately we need to shut it down. It's going to be curfew. So the first time since the dictatorship, since 1990, the first time that the military was on the street to repress civilians, the first time since the Pinochet dictatorship. It was very traumatic. So it was like, we cannot stop the movement, so we're just going to crush it in a way. And this created not what the government thought, but actually more mobilization. And then we had during the day, so when it's not like dangerous, women with children and millions of people out. And basically it was either he was going to get out in a helicopter out of the White House, or basically he was going to call for what the people were asking, which was a new constitution. So basically all of the protests in the street, they were very fragmented at the beginning. People wanted healthcare, education, pensions, the environment, different demands. And at the end of those 3 and odd weeks, people understood that was the system the problem, that all these demands needed to be gathered and the constitution itself needed to be recreated in a way, redrafted. And then this president was forced to basically create a process out of nothing to write a new constitution. But that process was really highly manicured and limited in a way, and allowed for some grassroots leaders and indigenous leaders to, for the first time, participate in politics. And that was a game changer. But it was very restricted in a way. It was very insulated from popular demands. Anyways, I was part of the advisory committee for the indigenous peoples and grassroots leaders, and we managed to get many of the articles across and being kind of the vehicles for the assemblies to put their demands for a new constitution to be created and to what they wanted in a way. So it was kind of a victory, but at the end it was sabotage from a social democratic government, a new president that came in. And basically the status quo won, because basically the elites want nothing to change, and they sabotage the process.
In the United States, it's George Washington states in his farewell address that the basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. And I've always thought of that as one of the most remarkable sentences in all of our documents, including the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And I mean, to define a nation as one which delegates the power to create their constitutions to the people, it's a remarkable achievement on the part of the framers to admit that this was, in fact, the reason why we fought the War of Independence. We wanted to create our own form of government. We didn't need a king anymore. And
yeah, but they didn't include that in the Constitution.
They didn't include it in the Constitution. But in his farewell address, he had to kind of admit to that this was the basis of our political system here in the United States. Yet, as you alluded to here, the process for calling for a convention has never really been clearly defined. I mean, they had a constituent assembly in Canada. Iceland had a crowdsourced constitutional convention of sorts, and that failed. New Zealand passed a referendum to change its electoral system, I think in 1996, I think it was. So there are some examples you can look to around the world for how we can organize an entire nation to uh, review their constitution and make proposals for changing it. But in the United States, it's a relatively it's a very obscure idea for most Americans. We don't know, we don't understand that we even have that power. Yet we do. And I really believe that we have that power. We could, and that's one of the things that we're working on here now is trying to organize people to call for a convention outside of the Article 5 process, of course. This is strictly a popular convention, which we feel is the only way that we're going to be able to make the kind of changes to our political system that will enable us to move forward into the 21st century with any kind of clarity and real security. And yet that process is very vague. There's a scholar here in the United States, George Van Cleve, who wrote a book called Making a New American Constitution. Sanford Levinson has written about this topic extensively, and as have others. But yet, there's no coherent process for doing that in the United States that we can really find. So the assembly process, as you pointed to in Chile, was instrumental in leading to that convention. Yet in the end, it got sabotaged. It wasn't successful. Do you look back and think to yourself what we might have done differently in Chile to be successful?
Well, I think it is one of the issues that I think also the scholars that you mentioned and the idea of a popular convention is also stuck in, which is the national convention. The idea that you're going to have a representative space with X amount of people that will decide for all. And this is not really a popular convention. It's just a representative convention of another sort. So in a way, representation or the voting for others is a form of aristocratic, selection. You are selecting others that are better than you to do the work. You are not doing the work. So one precedent that actually is written down in a constitutional form by one of the most brilliant minds ever alive, who was the Marquis of Condorcet, who wrote the 1793 Constitution for Revolutionary France. He basically created a constitutional system in which the people would assemble where they live in what he calls the primary assemblies. And primary assemblies would be connected in a network. And basically, they could create simple propositions that could be prompted into discussion into adjacent assemblies until you get a critical majority. And if that simple proposition is approved by a critical majority of the primary assemblies, then it becomes law or is pushed into Congress or into a new constitution, for example. So in a way, you need the people to be active. If we think about only replicating the system that we have, which is electing others to be in a convention and decide, then we are just mimicking the same system that the framers created, but a little bit better because it is closer to the people. But it's really the same system, the same technology, in a way, of the national constitution, which it was really criticized at the beginning of the 20th century by, for example, a Marxist thinker, Rosa Luxemburg, who was really a creative mind. And for her, this national convention was really a bourgeois institution. It was the assembly of the best. Even if they're working class, it doesn't matter. So we need to be able to be political. We are political animals, according to Aristotle. We need to really judge what are the rules that we are going to select to be the rules in common. So if we can get together and make some simple propositions of what we want a right to housing in which every person has a right to a place to live. This is very simple. this is part of something that could be, a consensus, a right to water, to the clean environment, right? To free education of quality, of equality among ethnic groups, equality of religion. All these things we can agree. So it's not that difficult. We can actually agree and vote on things. And the moment that we discuss, we become smarter citizens. And if we, in that way, we create a draft that is organic, that comes from the ground up, then it's really solid and is going to be supported by the majority because you're invested in it. It's different that if you select some person with one political color and then that person supports a text that you didn't even read or didn't understand or you have no attachment to, that will be very flimsy, very weak in a way. You need to have a different logic of organizing government itself, because if you're going to have a national convention of the people but then a constitution that looks very similar to the one that we have today, that basically replicates the representative structures without giving any power to the people, then nothing has changed. It's just an oligarchic democracy 2.0 in a way. So we really need to flip, the power from the top to the bottom and create institutions that are organic in a way and that people can actually access for people to exercise political power where they reside, where they inhabit, so they can protect their environments, they can decide the rules in common in the place that they live, and actually create solidarity across borders.
We had the No Kings March the other day. Tremendous outpouring by Americans in support of basically getting rid of this kind of authoritarian rule. Yet I don't see them expressing the kinds of things that would make a lasting change to our political system. So I see it as an enormous opportunity lost, where
Yes.
millions of people get together to get out there with their signs and protest and all that, but they're not focused on what I think you and I would agree are the actual systemic issues that need to be confronted. And so I guess the challenge would be to take those movements, indivisible, there's many of them in the United States, and get them focused on drafting resolutions. You feel like this would be the most effective way to go forward to change our constitution, creating statewide assembly movements perhaps, and that sort of thing.
Yes, and the No Kings March and movement, it's really an opposition to the corrupt individual in power in a way. Only if we get rid of this individual and we have a new government, everything will be fine. Part of this, even if people do not agree and they understand that the game is rigged, doesn't matter who is in power, they still basically march only to get rid of the bad apple instead of understanding that the basket is all rotten in a way, and you really need to thread it again, because you need to, if you know anything about organic decay, the moment that you have a little bit of decay in one part of the basket, all of the fruit go bad in a way. And if you preserve the basket, even if with a little bit of bacteria, it will spread faster than ever after that. So in a way, you need to really change the basket. And a No Kings protest is not going to change the basket. It's just going to get rid of some apples if they can, and then we replace with other apples that will go rotten very fast, or again, were rotten from the very beginning. There's, the US, it tends to be very partisan between Democrats and Republicans, and they think that their own presidents are the good ones and the other the bad ones. But the reality is, if we see the system through the lens of systemic corruption, we see that the inequality has been rising non-stop, doesn't matter who is in power, that actually the Democrats have pacted with big business in a manner that is even worse than the Republicans, and basically the same as militarism. Now we have, both parties really get into that business, and it's not relevant who is really president. It's a matter of degree, not of substance in a way. So I think the sooner that people understand that, and that the only way to change the system is from starting from the local. So you can create pockets of liberty, on autonomy, that you can actually run your own local government and you can create all kinds of innovations on the ground. And it's easier because you live there, because you can go to the office, because it's accessible. If you try to change the system from the national, from the federal, as Madison would say, it is all breaking apart, and basically it's very difficult for you to have a national movement that will change the system. So it's a no-go for me. It's like you're not going to change a law at the federal level. You can change it at the level of ordinance or statute at the local level. That is accessible, and you can branch and scale out from there in a way. You need to be able to be political where you live. It needs to be feasible for you, because the power of the people is always a power of numbers. So it's not about selecting the best among us. It's actually for everyone to participate into rebuilding the country from the ground up.
You're in the UK, and I'm familiar with Roger Hallam and the movement there, the Assemble UK movement, where they're calling for these kind of deliberative assemblies to take place. Um, I see that happening here also in the United States, and I'm working to kind of connect those two movements because they are so very much aligned in their goals to create a more democratic society, a more equal society. But even doing that's been difficult.
Yeah.
And I know everybody's busy. Roger's been in prison. He's had he's had a lot on his plate to deal with, and I've been really, really anxious to have a conversation with him because I feel like this has to be, as Thomas Paine said, a global movement. Democracy has to be global. And
Yes.
I understand that because equality, I mean, I guess the fear of the minority, one of them, which is, I think, to a degree legitimate, is that, chaos and yeah, the mob, could destroy the rule of law in a heartbeat if they were left uncontrolled, and to do what they wanted to do. So you can't trust the masses out there to govern themselves, But I think we can, and I think we absolutely must. We have to draw on the power of the people to organize and to envision the kind of world that they really want to live in, and to make that a reality. What opportunities do you see here in the United States for people to organize and to actually create a new constitution that will address these deficiencies? And we have to do it, in my view, very, very soon.
First, the issue of the tyranny of the majority. This is something that is in an ideological construct that was spread by the elites and that has no rooting in history. There's no tyranny of the majority anywhere in the world. And actually, the moments in history in which an actual majority, the working classes, not the vanguard, not a group, that the actual working classes took hold of the rules of power, of actually ruling, they were really conservative in the sense that they didn't want to do much of a transformation. They didn't know how, in a way, and they were not violent. They were really kind of appeasing, and wanted to change things for the better, in a way. The only times in which the kind of the masses take over is through a vanguard or a small elite of professional activists that then take over and undermine the whole the mass organization, as it happened with the Bolsheviks in Russia, right? Or even during the French Revolution, and the terror was always about an elite doing things that they were speaking for the people, but the people were not really present. So we need to really dispel the tyranny of the majority, because today we have the tyranny of the minority, the oligarchic minority, and they have no limits, and they have been destroying the earth and exploiting the people for centuries. So in a way, I think we really need to flip that and say we need the majority to be empowered, but empowered also within limits. We have learned through, human rights law, international law, post-war, that they are rights for all. The rights are not to pick and choose. Everybody has human rights and therefore need to be respected. So if we have the rule of the majority within constitutional constraints of human rights, not other propositions, but human rights only, then we can start thinking in a bounded manner, not to go against our neighbor or the people that are different, right? Or to impose my own morality on others. We need to have respect for others. And that kind of base will allow for a progress in the sense of more democratic progress instead of more decay. And I think in the US we have a great opportunity with nature. As you know, I collaborate with the CELDF, the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, to draft regulation at the local level, at the state level, protecting nature, and to allow to help basically communities to fight back against pollution, data centers, pollution of the rivers, something that is connected to them, to that community. The community gets activated when it is basically pushed to the limit. And when we have those kinds of crises, we have an opportunity to organize. And it's that opportunity that cannot be squandered into going to just to court in a way, because this is like the technical way of dealing with things that doesn't get you very far, but actually creating alternatives in which we can protect ourselves in a way and fight back against the companies and do really a collective work. And I think that could be done, as I said, in pockets, can be done in like islands of freedom in a sea of oligarchy, if you will, that can be connected. And those organizations must not be connected only within the territory, but it's global. So we have all kinds of communities around the world pushing against extraction and pollution everywhere. So I think we need to find strength in that kind of global connection that starts in the local and needs to remain in the local, and that sinks its roots in indigenous and ancestral knowledge of we humans as part of ecosystems instead of as humans separated from nature and therefore dominating nature, right? For the Western mind, nature is a form of property. We appropriate nature and create wealth out of it. For indigenous peoples, we are nature. We are guardians of the ecosystems, but we are not there to exploit. There's a different relation with nature that is not instrumental. So I think that can only change when you are collectively educating yourself and kind of trying to dismantle all the liberal scaffolding that is just constraining your imagination in which and how to relate with nature in a different way and politically in different ways.
So local and statewide deliberations in assemblies
Yes.
leading to some form of national assembly, which
Well, you can have resolutions because even if you have a national assembly, if you have national assembly with a blank check in a way, you do and you decide, then there's no attachment. You need to be able to draft, like same as Luther, that put all the in on the church and put it outside. You don't. It doesn't need to be complex.
Okay.
It needs to be approved by everyone. And for that, it needs to be simple and to the point.
Right.
And that can be done. So if you have a draft of like the 10 commandments for nature, for example, that are brought from below, then you have something. You have a document to push that is agreed by everyone. You have a platform that is not only representation, right? Because then they can decide whatever. And even if they decide something that is good, you're not attached to it. But if you have voted, if you have decided on every piece of that motion in a way or proposal, then you are authoring it for real in a way. That is what to be actually a legislator, that you're creating rules for ourselves. It doesn't need to be imposed on others to be law. It actually needs to be agreed upon by the people that are under that law. So in a way, even if we are at the local level and we apply that to our own locality, we're already being legislators at the ancient way of being legislators. So this is something that transforms, I think, your spirit, your identity. It transforms consumers of politics into citizens, real citizens that can engage in political action and decision making.
We have a deeply entrenched and corrupt elite that is governing this country now. Getting them, I mean, they have nuclear weapons, they have nuclear submarines, they've got all kinds of resources at their disposal. Getting them out of the system, getting their influence under control is, seems to me it's going to require much more than that, but maybe
Of
I'm wrong.
course. But you cannot do it without the organization on the ground. And this is the thing why it's so difficult, because you need to be able to control the elites and to organize popular power at the same time.
Right.
And this is kind of the challenge, but I think it is more feasible for us to start organizing at the bottom,
Okay.
and then seize the opportunity when it comes to that.
Right.
And one of the issues is not just, to organize politically, but you need to find an excuse or a way of doing it, or a purpose to do it. And you need to hack your own system. So if we think about the United States as a very entrepreneurial, place in which you can have your own business and participate in Wall Street, and all these things are open to you, then we should use that in order to strengthen local communities. I am now working on energy communities of residents that can have a renewable energy infrastructure in common, and can basically become a cooperative or other vehicle in which they have a stake in that kind of common infrastructure, and they can actually access money from it and be sustainable and autonomous and reinvest that money into their communities. So you can actually become more autonomous from the state and create a kind of this island of freedom in a way, and from there you can actually organize more and branch out in a way. But we need that kind of sustenance, if you will, at the local level, because we cannot do it alone, and we cannot just think that we're going to restrain the most powerful people in the world without numbers to be backed with, and without money. In a way, we need both. We need resources, and we need solidarity and hands to do it. So we need to work on that while you have this crisis, and while this is happening, that can give people an outlet, not only to protest against no kings, and this kind of against the bad apple, but actually doing something proactive, something that could be a safe haven when things got actually even worse than they are today. We need to be prepared in a way, and be prepared to have like a small fort, if you will, of freedom to be able to fight back.
Do you think we have an expiration date? Are we up against a hard deadline here? I mean, things are looking pretty grim.
Yeah, I think so. In the cycle of systemic corruption, the United States has become a decisively oligarchic democracy since the 1970s, getting worse and worse every day. And an oligarchic democracy ends up either in tyranny or on a revolution. And of course, we are at portas of a fascist, neo-fascist regime, in which there's already paramilitaries like the ICE agents. We have, people being killed and harassed, and all our rights being, trespassed. This is already happening in real time. So we are at the moment of brink in which the oligarchic democracy is becoming a tyranny, devolving into a tyranny. And that tyranny will last as long as it can stand by itself, in a way, by force. And the only way that that tyranny is going to become undone is by either a coup from a breakaway part of the elite. The part of the elite that are not benefiting directly from him, they will, stage a coup and take over, which will become another oligarchic democracy. Or we will have a popular revolution in which this kind of system will become undone, and there's a new possibility for a new beginning, as the philosopher Hannah Arendt would put it in the 20th century. We humans have, by birth, are kind of miracles, because we have creativity that cannot really be subsumed to our past or our relations. We create things not from nothing, but really it's imagination, and what she called natality is in us. We are new beginnings. So the moment that we have crisis, and we have a systemic corruption of the system that we have now, that is an oligarchy and turned into a tyranny, then there is a possibility for that breakage to allow for a new beginning. Of course, it's very difficult, and we are seeing that now with the upcoming elections. Trump already says that he will have, the National Guard or similar in the streets. So we're going to have military in the streets, people not being able to vote. And the probability that that election will take place is very low, according to my own view. So we are approaching the end of kind of this oligarchic experiment and going in a full-blown tyranny that will become a state of emergency for a long while. So we need to be prepared.
Okay. Camilla, great conversation. Anything else that you want to point out to our listeners before we go?
Well, I think we need to be positive in the sense that many people lament that the state that we are now and would prefer to go back a couple of years and just keep decaying slowly. I think we are in a crisis and we need to make the best of it. And we need to be prompted into action. And people that were dormant before, the same as in Chile, people that didn't vote, were not organized at all, from one day to the next, they became, active citizens. So it can be done. If it happened in Chile, it can happen in the US, it can happen anywhere. The issue is to be prepared to channel that energy in a productive way that could create a new system that is more just and in harmony with nature.
Great. All right. Thank you. That's a great way to wrap it up, I think. And I don't have any other questions. I mean, I have 1,000 questions, really, but the main one for me is, as an organizer, what can I do to help bring this movement more together? And I've created a thing we call the Democratic Constitution Forum Zoom call. It meets once a month. And I'm reaching out to everybody I can find in the United States who's talking about constitutional kinds of changes. And there are lots of them. There are hundreds of people and dozens of organizations that are really devoted to that particular goal. But they're all working separately. We're not working together. So that's one thing I'm trying to do, is kind of knit together that network of groups and organizations so it becomes a little bit more unified and has a clearer goal, one that's shared amongst everybody that we can achieve. And I think that process is underway now. It still needs to develop. I think we need a few more months to bring more actors into the conversation. But I think that's about the best thing I can think to do right now. Some people are working on assemblies. Some people are working on amendments. Other people are working on a constitutional convention for 2076, which I think is way too far out from now. And there are other people calling for national constitutional conventions and such. So there is a lot of activity in the country going on right now. And I think, as you point out, as this administration becomes more of a concern to more Americans, the interest in addressing the deficiencies in our political system will be rising rapidly. So I hope to catch that wave and hopefully make a real change in the United States. In my view, it needs to happen, tomorrow. I'm frankly very discouraged about it all. I'm very, very worried that we're not going to respond to the emergencies that we're facing. But all we can do is try.
Yes, and I think what you're doing is great in the sense of putting people together in the same page, because there's a lot of energy and effort. And basically it's like little outbursts and they're little lights in this very dark place. And we really need to put them in the same room to have a common agenda. Yeah. And to have a common agenda that has different steps, and everybody can have a task in this great, plan. But there needs to be a common plan, a common strategy. Yeah. So count me in any of these conversations. I'm happy to participate. And I think we need a grand strategy for sure. Yeah. And we cannot have these independent energies just go to be diluted by, all that what is happening. It's very difficult already to keep, our little light on. We need to really, turn into fire.
Great. All right, Camilla, thanks so much for having this conversation with us. It's great. And we will be in touch. And I think there's going to be a lot of exciting things happening in the year ahead. So stay tuned. I'm looking forward to hearing what this year's convention delegates propose for changes to our now outdated and increasingly dangerous Constitution. Organizing for a constitutional convention of the people will be a daunting process. Educating Americans about their Constitution, their most fundamental democratic right to make and to alter their constitutions of government, as Washington put it, will take time, even though we love our framers. Most Americans could not tell you that the basis of our form of political system is the right to alter and make our constitutions. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, there is a movement growing in America to restore the democracy we thought we once had. If it is a hallmark of a great civilization to be able to talk peacefully about how we organize ourselves as a nation, how we govern ourselves, we will have to find a way to address these core issues, despite the reality that our government has been captured by special interests. Tune in next time when we talk about the role of assemblies in the process of democratic renewal, when I speak to Dr. Camila Vagaris on her book, System Corruption, and how citizens' assemblies can lead to true democratic renewal.